Cathy Johnson was born in India and raised in Northern California. She has a Master of Science in Psychological Counseling and is currently in her final semester of the Master of Biblical and Theological Studies here at Dallas Theological Seminary. Her husband of 5 years, Avinash, is also a DTS student in the THM program, and he is here to support his wife, if you want to wave. They both share, he didn't, but I called attention to him. They both share a love for theology, music, and adventure. Will you please give Cathy Johnson a warm welcome?
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that many of us are familiar with Psalm 23. Oops, sorry. We underline it in our Bibles, hang it on our walls, maybe even post it on social media. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. But what if we were honest about what our lives really look like in the 21st century? Marcia Hornock writes an antithesis to Psalm 23, and it goes like this. The clock is my dictator, I shall not rest. Kind of feels that way for me right now. It makes me lie down only when exhausted. It leads me to deep depression. It hounds my soul. It leads me in circles of frenzy for activity's sake. Even though I run frantically from task to task, I will never get it all done, for my ideal is with me. Deadlines and my need for approval, they drive me. They demand performance from me beyond the limits of my schedule. They anoint my head with migraines. My in-basket overflows. Surely fatigue and time pressure shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the bonds of frustration forever. Can anyone relate? Yeah. We live hectic lives, and as believers, whether we are working inside the home or out, we're expected to meet all of these personal and professional demands and have our relationship with God be more intimate than ever before. In fact, if this stool, let's say, were to represent our responsibilities, it would probably look something like that. So we delegate, we find creative ways to manage time. In fact, if we could delegate spending quality time with family and friends after a long day at work, or even at school or at home, I wonder how many of us would do it. But we all know relationships can't be delegated or fast-tracked. And while all other responsibilities require you to run, a relationship requires you to sit. And a relationship with Jesus requires a little more. It requires us to sit and let sit. Luke teaches us how in chapter 10, verse 38 to 42. You can follow along in your Bibles or on the screen. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him as a guest. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he said. But Martha was distracted with all the preparations she had to make, so she came up to him and said, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work alone? Tell her to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed. Mary has chosen the best part, and it will not be taken away from her." For us to sit and let sit, there are 3 behaviors we need to adopt. Make room to sit, make room for others to sit, and sit first, serve later. The first behavior is make room to sit, and one way we make room is by making time. Now, usually when we read this passage, we tend to commend Mary and condemn Martha. But we need to recognize Mary's opportunity to sit at Jesus' feet actually came through Martha's invitation. In verse 38, it says, Martha welcomed him as a guest. She received him hospitably. She entertained him. In those days, welcoming meant far more than just casually inviting someone into your busyness. It meant a lot of work. So can you imagine being a host to the Lord? Whew. I'd be stressed hosting any one of you. I wish I had kids to blame it on, but I don't. Martha, on the other hand, took initiative, and she made the time. Wayne Gretzky, a professional ice hockey player, once famously said, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take." Now, I wonder how many shots at deeper intimacy with God we've missed because we didn't make the time. Ask yourself, what do I need to clear off of my stool? Create a calendar event if you need to, and work the rest of your day around it. We certainly do this for other things. Make room by making time. Another way we make room is by actively listening. In verse 39, Luke is portraying Mary as a disciple here, saying she sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he said. And the word for sat implies that she took initiative. She didn't do this out of obligation or to be polite, and she continued to listen to Jesus. Now, we're not told that Mary said anything, but her silence speaks volumes. Active listening means total focus, suspending other distractions. And surely Martha wanted to listen too. Let's cut her some slack. She did invite him after all. But she was distracted. When my husband and I were newlyweds, we were invited to a friend's house for a meal. They let us in, and I kid you not, for 20 minutes straight, no one sat with us. To be fair, they were getting things ready, but no one actually stopped to have a conversation. And we couldn't help but think, why invite us if you weren't planning on spending any time? But isn't that kind of like what we do to God sometimes? Many of us enjoy multitasking, and to be fair, podcasts have made the 75 somewhat bearable. But what has that done to our relationship with God? Do we only give him our distracted leftovers, saying, God, I'm listening in here, but just busy with other things as well, like cooking or driving or working out? In the Gospel of John, we read of Martha's devotion to Jesus, so we know that she's a disciple. And yet it's Mary who's behaving like one here. You may be a disciple, but are you behaving like one? Make room by actively listening. Now, in the pursuit of making room, we need to recognize our needs can become our obstacle. Martha calls on Jesus saying, Lord, don't you care? And by her asking those words, she's questioning Jesus' identification with her situation. She feels overburdened, but unseen, isolated, alone. And nothing hinders fellowship like perceived indifference. When we ask if God cares about our situation, we're asking if he identifies with us, if he sees us, if he understands us. In a sense, we're asking, God, do you really know what it's like to be me? Because if you did, you wouldn't expect this much from me. You wouldn't let my hard work go in vain. You wouldn't let somebody else get promoted for the job. God, do you really know what it's like to be me? And the incarnation answers a resounding yes. He knows. Each gospel writer highlights a different aspect of Christology, and Luke focuses on the humanity of Jesus. And it's no question he does this, especially when dealing with discipleship. See, the divinity of Jesus warrants our submission, but the humanity of Jesus wins our devotion. Christ identifies with us. There is nothing he doesn't see. Don't be fooled into thinking otherwise. Martha, focusing on her perceived needs, got in the way of her relationship with Jesus. But can you imagine how differently the scene would have played out if she chose instead to identify with Jesus by aligning her priorities with his? The issue of fellowship is an issue of identification. So identify with Jesus, not your needs, lest they become your obstacle. The second behavior we need to adopt is to make room for others to sit. Again, in the same verse, Martha calls on Jesus, tell her to help me. But notice the reason behind her request. She had a list of preparations she had to make, and Mary wasn't helping her do them. Sounds like a younger sibling to me. I don't think Martha was trying to maliciously steal Mary away from Jesus, but it shows us where her focus was and the danger of not keeping our priorities in check. Word of caution, our needs can become someone else's obstacle as well. I love chapel at DTS. Full disclosure, I'm not always the most regular in attendance. My husband, on the other hand, loves chapel and is very regular. But there have been some moments where I've asked him to skip it, either to spend time with me or to watch it online while he finishes up some work around the house. And if he schedules his time alone with God when I want family time, I can feel snubbed sometimes. It seems innocent, but what I'm really doing is getting in the way of his relationship with God. Have you ever been a hindrance to someone listening to God because they were doing it at a time that wasn't convenient for you? How many of us get a little annoyed by businesses closed on Sundays, for example? You never crave Chick-fil-A like you do on a Sunday afternoon. Why? Barry Jones in his book Dwell says, "For me to cease working, but to demand that others work on my behalf, is to make Sabbath about my own self-fulfillment." We're not just called to sit, we're called to let sit. So make room for others. The final behavior we need to adopt is to sit first, serve later. Jesus tells Martha, "You're worried about many things, but one thing is needed." Now, we can't take this to mean service is unnecessary. This story comes right after the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus teaches that God expects service in fulfillment of the command to love your neighbor. But Jesus highlights two commands: love God, love your neighbor. And it's this first command, greater in priority, that Mary chooses or exemplifies. Friends, sitting with Jesus is the best part, not all the work we get to do for him. And notice, Jesus doesn't rebuke Martha for serving, but for her being worried and overly concerned about it, and possibly other things. There is a time to sit and a time to serve. Jesus isn't burdening us with yet another priority on our list of first priorities. He's freeing us to replace every single item on that list with just one. Everything left, second at best. What we can also learn from this is that what is necessary isn't necessarily urgent. Martha was pulled away by her tasks. There were responsibilities that had to be done. She didn't make them up. But they didn't need to be done right then. And if procrastinating has taught us anything, it's that delaying your tasks won't miraculously make them disappear. Trust me, I've tried. Your tasks have no choice but to wait for you, so sit first, serve later. And what's beautiful here is that when we choose to sit with Jesus, it will not be taken away from us. Jesus protects our time with him, like he did with Mary. May we, as disciples of Christ, learn from both Mary and Martha how to sit and let sit by making room to sit, making room for others to sit, and sitting first, serving later, so that we can truthfully declare, "The Lord, not the clock, is my shepherd. I shall not want." So the next time you see a stool or a chair, you know what to do. Thank you.